They told stories of outlaws who laughed under green canopies, who feasted on venison with ale in hand, who stole from the rich and spared the poor. But England never told those stories. Not in the villages that slept under royal taxes, not in the forests where the king claimed every branch, every creature, every breath of wind as his own, and not in the lives of the men who crossed those boundaries, men who did not become legends, only fugitives. The records say their footsteps were quiet, but not because they were skilled, because fear makes silence effortless. A single wrong trail, a snapped twig, the print of a boot in soft mud, any of these could betray them, not to sheriffs or soldiers or noblemen riding in polished mail, but to the forest law, a system so severe it could turn an ordinary man into prey with one mistake. Most of them hadn't killed. Most hadn't stolen anything grand. Some had simply taken a deer because their children were hungry. Some had cut wood from the wrong thicket. Some had walked across land that, a week earlier, was common pasture, until the king declared it his. They didn't flee to the forest for adventure. They fled because the alternative was worse, paying for jail time they couldn't afford, facing punishments they couldn't survive, or waiting for a jury that might never gather. So they hid among the oaks and thorns, their stomachs knotted with hunger, their clothes stiff with dirt, their names slowly dissolving into silence. And somewhere, between these forgotten men and the legends that replaced them, lies the story England tried hardest to forget, the story of what it truly meant to be a medieval outlaw. To understand why so many men vanished into the green shadows of medieval England, you have to begin with the forests, and what they truly were. They weren't public land. They weren't wilderness. They weren't even nature in the way we imagine it today. They were property, royal property. By the 11th century, England's kings had declared enormous stretches of land. Woods, heaths, fields, rivers, even entire villages, as forest. Not because trees grew there, but because the king wanted the right to hunt there. Under forest law, the deer, the boar, even the brush where they slept belonged entirely to the crown. A poacher wasn't stealing food. He was stealing from the king himself. And the punishments reflected that idea. Under William the Conqueror, killing a deer could mean blinding. His son, William Rufus, replaced even that with mutilation, imprisonment, or death. Later, kings added fines so steep they ruined entire households. Most English families didn't live far from a royal forest. The boundaries shifted whenever a king wished. Lines drawn across maps without regard for the people already living there. One season, a family gathered firewood where their grandparents had gathered it. The next season, doing so was a crime. A family that killed a boar for the winter could suddenly find themselves branded criminals. A boy who snared a rabbit could be hauled before the king's officers. These weren't hardened thieves. They weren't rebels. They were people who still needed to eat, people who couldn't always tell when the border between home and forest had silently changed. And this was the first truth England hid beneath the legend. Outlaws weren't born in the forest. The forest made them. If we look only at the laws, it's easy to ask, why didn't they just stand trial? Why run? Why vanish? The answer is simpler, and far harsher than the legend allows. In medieval England, going to jail was not a punishment. It was a bill. Prisons were private, and inmates had to pay for the privilege of being locked inside. Food cost money. Water cost money. Even straw on the floor cost money. A man accused of a small crime, snaring a deer, taking wood, missing taxes, could spend weeks waiting for a jury to assemble, and every day inside the jail pushed his family deeper into debt. Some sold tools. Some sold animals. Some lost their homes. Others never even made it to trial because local lords pressured jurors, intimidated witnesses, or simply delayed proceedings until the accused starved. So, when a villager was arrested for poaching or petty theft, the choice wasn't innocent or guilty. It was pay for jail or disappear. Many disappeared. They slipped into the woods at night, not far, just far enough. Some left behind wives who swore they had no idea where they'd gone. Some told their families nothing at all, hoping they'd be spared retaliation. And once a man fled, he was legally an outlaw. No rights, no protection, no standing before the law. Anyone could harm him. Anyone could refuse him food. Anyone could kill him with no consequence. The penalty for fleeing justice was permanent. No wonder so many never came back. This was the second truth buried beneath the stories. Men didn't run to the forest because they believed in freedom. They ran because England left them no other path. Legends say that outlaws feasted. They drank ale beneath the oaks, laughed around fires, carved venison from the bone. The reality was closer to famine. A man alone in the forest could hunt, yes, but only at enormous risk. Every animal in a royal forest was the king's property. Killing one remained a capital crime for centuries. So outlaws learned to eat what no one valued. They took the numbles, the organs of a deer left behind after nobles took the meat. They scraped marrow. They boiled bone. They gathered roots and nettles. They trapped small birds. They stole whatever monks, travelers, or merchants carried. Some lived on bread crusts left behind at abbeys. Some stretched one rabbit over 3 days. Some survived on berries and bitter greens. A few bands, especially those protected by nobles, managed better. But most outlaws lived day to day, one quiet hunger gnawing at another. The English climate made it worse. Rain soaked everything. Cold wind tore through clothes. Fires drew attention. Food spoiled. Many outlaws lost weight so quickly that chronic stomach pain became normal. Many developed infections from the cuts that never healed. Many died not from arrows or soldiers, but from pneumonia. Yet people in the villages shared stories of Robin Hood roasting deer, singing with his merry men, helping the poor. Those tales traveled much farther than the truth. The truth was this: an outlaw didn't eat like a hero. He ate like a man hiding from the world, surviving however he could, and rarely more than that. We imagine medieval forests as protective walls, quiet, dark, full of hiding places. But ask anyone who lived beneath that canopy. Forests do not shelter. Forests expose. There was no safe season. In spring, branches dripped endlessly, soaking clothes until they chilled through the skin. In summer, insects filled the air, midges, flies, mosquitoes, feeding on any man who held still for a moment. In autumn, storms broke branches like spears and filled the ground with mud deep enough to trap boots. And winter. Winter erased everything except cold. An outlaw had no door to close, no walls to lean against, no roof to sleep under. Shelter meant anything that kept the rain off: a rotted tree trunk, a rocky overhang, a shallow ditch. Some dug pits to escape the wind. Others slept in abandoned charcoal burners' huts, if they found one before the king's rangers burned it. A fire could warm you. It could also reveal you. Smoke was a signal, visible for miles across the open fields. So outlaws rarely lit one. They shivered instead. They patched their clothes with whatever they found: strips of cloth, scraps of hide, rope stolen from travelers. Some wore boots so worn that water seeped through with every step. If they caught fever, and many did, they had no healer, no herbs beyond what they recognized, and no rest. The forest could feed you, hide you, and kill you, often in the same week. The songs never mention this kind of exile. But the records do, and they tell us plainly. The forest wasn't freedom. It was punishment carried out by the weather. Not every outlaw starved. Some wore armor. Among the most notorious was the Foleville gang, led by Eustace Foleville, the son of a respected knight. He and his brothers were not forest fugitives scraping for roots. They were young men from the gentry, armed, trained, and protected by influence. Their crimes were bold: kidnapping, extortion, robbery, and murder. One of the brothers, Richard, was even a clergyman, yet fully part of the violence. They didn't hide in wet thickets. They stayed in manor houses owned by their allies. They moved at night in groups of 50 or more. They held noblemen for ransom. And when the king's officers tried to capture them, local lords often warned them first. The Fulvilles terrified entire counties, not because they were desperate, but because they were powerful. Yet even they shaped the legend. Later, storytellers softened their crimes, insisting they acted for the common good. Some called them heroes of the people. Sound familiar? It should. The seeds of Robin Hood's myth grew not from starving peasants, but from noble-born criminals whose lives bore little resemblance to the outlaw stories England now treasures. And this contrast matters, because it reveals something the legend hides. Outlaw was not one kind of man. It was a sentence, and anyone, poor or rich, hungry or well-fed, could fall under it, for reasons England often refused to write down. The earliest stories of Robin Hood were not tales of charity or justice. They were brief ballads, sharp, violent, irregular, spread by traveling minstrels. In them, Robin Hood robbed monks, killed sheriffs, ambushed travelers. He wasn't rescuing orphans or redistributing wealth. He was simply winning, clever, quick, and dangerous. It wasn't until the 15th and 16th centuries that writers softened him. They gave him principles. They surrounded him with companions. They pushed his story into Sherwood Forest and Nottingham, away from the harsher truth of the medieval legal system. By the time of the Tudors, Robin Hood had transformed into something England needed: a harmless folk hero, a noble thief, a symbol of merry rebellion that threatened nothing. He became the outlaw people wanted to imagine: free, generous, daring, instead of the outlaw England actually created. Why? Because the real story was uncomfortable. It told of kings who took land from villagers, of laws designed to protect animals more fiercely than people, of punishments that blinded men for feeding their families, of forests that swallowed the poor and sheltered the powerful. A legend can't carry that weight. But history can. And once you look past the myth, past the green hoods, the arrows, the feasts, what remains is a portrait of a world where becoming an outlaw was not an adventure. It was a collapse of safety, of livelihood, of belonging. And the legend exists because England preferred a story it could celebrate over a truth it would rather forget. When a medieval man fled into the forest, he didn't simply leave behind a village. He left behind a world. His wife could not claim his land. His children lost inheritance. His tools could be seized by the manor. His debts multiplied. And his name, legally, no longer existed. To harbor him was a crime. To feed him was a crime. To speak with him could bring suspicion. Some outlaws returned after years, thin, ragged, unrecognizable. Some were captured when they ventured close to the villages they missed. Some tried to blend in with crowds during fairs, only to be spotted by a neighbor. Others were never seen again. Records list them coldly: absconded, fugitive, beyond the peace of the king. Behind every one of those entries was a family whose world narrowed, a home that fell into ruin, a life that fractured. Of all medieval punishments, outlawry was the most total. It severed a man from every law that protected him. If he died, no inquiry followed. If he was robbed, no justice came. If he was murdered, no one answered for it. And the forest kept its secrets. Years later, bones were sometimes found beneath roots or washed into streams during storms. Some were buried quietly. Some were left where they lay. No songs were written for them. No ballads held their names. They vanished from the world in the same silence that once protected them. This was the cost hidden behind the merry stories, a cost the legend never had to pay. Robin Hood survived because he was useful. He gave England a hero whose rebellion was safe, a thief who stole only from the corrupt, a fighter who harmed only villains, a man whose defiance never shook the foundation of the kingdom. He was the outlaw the crown could tolerate, and the outlaw the people could love. But the real men, the real fugitives, the ones who shivered beneath dripping branches and slipped silently between trees, they left nothing behind. They couldn't afford to. Outlaws didn't write letters. They didn't keep journals. They rarely stayed long enough in one place to tell their stories. The myth survived because it was tidy. The truth disappeared because it wasn't. Later, writers polished the tales. Victorian historians softened them even further. Stage plays added romance. Films added honor. Novels added causes and principles. But when you strip all that away, when you walk backward through centuries of storytelling, you reach a silence filled not with triumph, but with exhaustion. A life spent trying to avoid punishment. A death that came without witness. A story swallowed by the same forest that once promised safety. And the legend grew precisely because reality could not compete. It is easier to love the outlaw who lived in a song than to remember the outlaw who died in the rain. The England that created these men is gone. The forests have thinned, the laws have changed, and the paths once used by fugitives now carry hikers, dogs, cyclists, and sunlight. But if you walk them slowly, in early morning, when the mist still hangs between the trees, you might feel something older lingering there. A boundary that once shifted without warning, a silence that once meant danger, a shadow that once held not a hero, but a man who had nowhere else to stand. Most of the outlaws who lived here will never have names. Their stories dissolved long before ink ever found parchment, but their reality remains. In court rolls, in forest records, in the tight, careful notes of medieval clerks who wrote down only crimes, never lives. And that reality is harder, quieter, and more human than any ballad. A man who fled because he could not pay for jail. A man who stole a deer because his children were hungry. A man who risked everything because the law left him nothing. England kept the legend. The forest kept the truth. And now, centuries later, that truth finally steps out from beneath the trees. Not in triumph, but in the harsh honesty of what it meant to survive beyond the king's peace.